during my time at Google, I've worked with about 20 different engineering teams. And at any given time, I'm working with a group of 3 teams. Today, I want to talk to you about one of those teams in particular, and that's the feedback team. Now, this is a team, consists of a few engineers, a product manager, and me, the designer. And the reason why the feedback team was so important to Google Search is that our older feedback system could take a while to help other engineering teams know what was wrong with their product. And that's a huge problem because feedback is a lot like sushi. When it's fresh, it's fabulous, but when it's old, it can be dangerous. Once feedback ages too long, you're fixing the wrong thing. And so when I worked with the feedback team, the first thing we had to figure out was when someone asked a question like this, how did they respond to an answer from the internet? An answer that's accurate and a little sarcastic. It's not from Google or the Knowledge Graph, but it's one that we found on a website that we trust. And so what we did as a team was we implemented a feedback system where people could tell us if what they saw on the internet was wrong, if it was inaccurate, or even if it was awesome. And this box was surprisingly awesome to people. They actually loved the personality inside of it. As I started my work with the feedback team to see how we could gather more feedback from our users, I found that, like almost every other team I've worked with at Google, the time I spent with them fell into a bimodal distribution. At the very beginning of a project, you spend a lot of time with the team, getting to know them, getting them ramped up, and getting yourself ramped up on what they're working on. Throughout the middle of the project, there might be less interaction, but there doesn't mean there's less work going on. And then toward the end of the project, the distribution ramps up again, where you're implementing your new product. So when I think about this first segment of the distribution in terms of how I was going to interact with the feedback team, I had an idea of what I wanted to start with them. And it's pretty easy for me to remember. It's SPF, like sunscreen, our stakeholders, our principles, and our flows. Getting together a list of stakeholders can take from a few minutes to 30 minutes with a team. So with the feedback team, we found that our stakeholders were internal teams who we wanted to implement this new feedback system, the people we actually wanted to fill out forms on Google search products, and the feedback team ourselves, because we had to maintain the system and offer reporting for it. And then, of course, executives, who could decide at any time to break up our team and move us to other projects. So what we do is we take these different groups of stakeholders and we figure out the product principles that they most value. So for the feedback team, we knew we wanted our product to be fast, flexible, and consistent. For the internal teams, though, they wanted something that could be customized. And then for users, it had to be effortless and quick and even personable. And now as a team, we don't just write down a bunch of words on a page. For the principles that we choose for each of these stakeholder groups, we have to fully explain what it means for that group, for the product to be customized or for it to be consistent. The reason that we figure out who the stakeholder teams are and then develop these product principles is because when conflicts arise around a product and the user experience of a product, and they almost always do, it gives us a chance to herald back to these principles. So when an internal team asks us for special customizations, we can weigh that against the people giving feedback who want something effortless and quick that they don't even have to think about or learn. So in this case, an internal team asked us to include screenshots in the feedback system. And our team pushed back because that added a lot of weight to the user experience. It meant that we'd have to ask for additional privacy permissions, that somebody would have to upload a screenshot from their device, which could take a lot of time and a lot of data. And instead, we could go back to our principles and say, does this fit in? And that way, instead of me as the designer being the only person who's responsible for the customer experience or the user experience, the entire team has already reached consensus about what we want this product to be, and everyone in the team can think about the standpoint of your principles and argue for those. The final part of SPF are flows. So if you're thinking about getting head of a product team, which is always my concern, I don't know about with you guys if you're on a team from the very beginning, but often how we work is I might join a team a month after they've started engineering, 6 months after, 12 months after, 2 years after they've started an engineering process, because they're trying to figure if something can even be built. And then once they've figured out that something can be built, they say, oh, we should probably design this. And so what I do with the team is I establish the high-level flows that we need. So considering our principles for our product and where we want to go, the brief we've created, create flows, and then winnow those flows down as well, so that your team can get building on the product they need to go forward with. Now, while this is happening in the very beginning of the process, I am doing a check-in with my team. For the teams that I work with, I prefer to check in on Monday morning, and this is just a simple stand-up. Here's what I'm doing this week, what are you guys up to? And this is our UX check-in. And that's what it's called on the calendar, UX check-in, which means that every engineer on my team has 2 user experience events on their calendar every week, and they take up very little time. The next one is on Thursday morning. The reason these are spaced this way is so that on Monday morning we can figure out what we're doing, and then have enough time to work with no meetings on Wednesday. And then on Thursday morning, present our work to each other and see what we need to fix or update or create. We don't meet to make new things on Fridays. Instead, as a team, we give each other enough time and enough feedback to create a product together. Now, during the middle part of the flow is where my interactions with the team drop to almost nil. My engineering teams are heads down, trying to figure out how to make something that fits our new user experience guidelines, which means that my responsibility is to provide detailed designs to them. For these engineering teams, it doesn't mean just giving them design, but also telling them how far along the design is. So they want to know, is this going to change at a probability of 25%? Is it set in stone at the 50% mark? Are we 75% of the way there? And one of the ways that your teams will be able to tell this is by the style guides that you create. So what I like to do is not just tell my team something is gray, and I don't just give my team a hex code. But instead for our products, I create style guides that create an entire lexicon for the product itself, which means that with the engineering team coming up with names for each of the components they'll be building, and then having exact guidelines that go along with those names. And I don't just throw them up on a website, but instead what I do is I include links to my style guide in every single email I send to my team, and in my chat status, and in any communication that I have in our bug operating system, because I want them to know at any time that they can get this information without ever talking to me, without tapping me on the shoulder. They know that I stop checking email at 5:30, but they might still have a question because they stay up a lot later than I do. During this middle time, it's also really important for me to think about the areas that trip me up. I suck at icon design, just completely and absolutely. I never met a vector I couldn't mess up. And so it's not worth my team's time for me to spend 2 days trying to create a new icon for our product. It's worth our time for me to find an icon designer that we can come back to over and over again. But the next time you start to get burrowed into something really exciting and really focused on learning a new feature, a new product, think about how much of your team's time you're spending as well. For me, the biggest danger is that my engineering team will be waiting for me to finish, and that means that instead of them working on what I want them to build, they're going off and building whatever they want to instead. Now, the last part of this distribution is one where I have to say the thing that I should never have to say to any designer, ever. And that's that you should be sitting with your team. You should be sitting with your team this entire time. But this is the part where your feedback loop needs to get a lot tighter, and you'll need to learn how to balance the ways that people want to hear from you. So with the teams that I work with, what I try to do is, because I work at a company that has 50,000 people at it, and I work with 3 different engineering teams at a time, I try to actually set up a desk for myself with each of the engineering teams I work with, which means that I have desks in 3 different buildings on 3 different floors, and they're desks that I share with other people, like a hotel room. And that's the way that I'm able to actually work with these engineering teams. It's not by sitting with a bunch of other designers. Sitting with a bunch of other designers is a great way to improve your design skills, but it's not a great way to build a product. And one of the best ways I can get ahead of my engineering team is by thinking about the things that are the edge cases for design. So what are the transitions for my product like? And I can make my engineers really happy if I think about internationalization as well. So do you guys have a go-to language that you use when you try to internationalize? I see some smiles. So we start in English. A lot of people like to use German. But I actually find that Spanish is really useful for internationalization and surprisingly long compared to a lot of German words. So I highly suggest that as a method. And the other thing that shows you care about your engineering team and you're trying to get ahead of where they're building is to also think about those error cases. What happens when the photo doesn't upload? What happens when somebody enters too much data? In our case, what happens when somebody tries to submit the feedback form without entering any feedback? How do we show an error, and how do we be kind about it? And by giving this information to your engineering team before they ask for it, it shows that you're thinking about where they are, because they're one of your stakeholder groups. For the feedback program, what I found is that our team communicated in a few different ways. We communicated via email, we communicated via chat, and we communicated via a bug system. But the person who was implementing the front end only communicated via our bug system, which meant that I needed to change my behavior. Because when I requested that items be moved literally by 2 pixels over, if they were an email, they went unheard. But by including them in our bug system, they became part of a checklist for another person. And a lot of times, we consider ourselves as designers to be very user-focused and to think about who is interacting with our systems. But when you hand over design, that's another interaction that you need to account for. And so are you thinking about your engineers, who are your users at that time? I would really appreciate feedback from you, ideally now rather than later. And I welcome questions as well. I think we actually have a little tiny bit of time. Thank you, Jared.
Excellent. Thank you, Abby. So we'll take some questions, but I'm wondering, as you found these teams, what was there an interesting pattern that began to emerge as you worked longer with teams? Are there things that they tend to get better at, or things that you tend to find you have to help them more with, or anything like that?
So I have found that one of the most cruel things we can do is introduce an entirely new design language to teams that have become very familiar with the previous one.
Use some sort of new material.
Yeah, it's really difficult on teams who've become very
how did that
comfortable.
go? What? I mean, that was like a sort of, bam, here it is, corporate-wide, everybody's got to start using it thing? Is that how it worked internally, or did some teams get access to it long before others? I actually don't know how it rolled out internally.
Oh, well, I can only speak to the way that I've been using it, and that's that as our products improve and progress, we look for places where it makes sense to introduce material design into the product and go from there. So, sorry, I can't give you a more in-depth answer than that.
That's okay. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
I'm curious, though, in bringing material out, were there certain challenges that you saw teams repeatedly have?
I think the So a few things. One of them is that people get kind of freaked out about potentially losing all of the features that their products have. We get really comfortable with certain designs that we experience over and over again. And as far as my experience at Google, what happens is I'll work with an engineering team for somewhere between 3 and 18 months. And the people on I'm working on the books team right now, people on that team have been on that team for at least 5 years. They're really experienced. Their life is Google Books. And I've been on that team for 2 months now. So for them, there's a bit of a worry. Like, does bringing in a designer and having somebody make something new threaten everything we love? Or does it mean that we get something fresh and interesting and actually helpful for our users? And so it's balancing that. And I think right from the very beginning, with those flows is highlighting the most important use cases for a product and really showing your team that, for us, I understood where they were coming from and what was really important to them and what was really important to the users of Google Books. And so not abandoning public libraries just because we're rolling out a hot new design system.
Okay. What questions do you folks have for Abby? Okay, start over here. Just raise your hand if you have a question and we'll bring you a mic.
Thank you. Great presentation, by the way. I was wondering, so was relatively easy to create a 1.0 version of the style guide because it's new, just like a fresh sushi. But then when 2.0 comes out, how would you manage, what advice do you have to manage that transition when you roll out a new version? Obviously, like in most cases, we don't want to roll out something completely new overnight. Would you suggest to start with a certain area, and how would you communicate with your team about the change lies ahead of them?
So in a lot of cases, the decision to have an overall design change across a company is not one that I get to make. So being at such a huge company, I don't get to choose whether or not we move over to material design. That's somebody else's choice. But there are different ways that you break the news to your team, right? And so part of it is, as quickly as possible, if you have some command that you have to implement a new system, is showing your team a way that it benefits them. And so for the books team, what's really nice about material design is that we get this entire canvas to work with. And up until now, books have been really limited to this tiny viewport to look at. And so the nice thing about exploring new designs and material is that suddenly a book doesn't have to be this tiny scrolling item on a screen. We can actually think about it as taking up this entire canvas space and then dropping in the components like searching inside a book as we need them. And so by being able to show, I just showed some designs to the team the other day, by being able to show them this whole canvas view of a book, it was suddenly like, oh, this is how I actually experience a book in real life. I get to see the entire book at one time, not just one slim scanned page. And so more quickly you can even have anything it doesn't have to be super high fidelity, but clickable prototypes are really nice. Then the team can start interacting with it, playing with it, and getting on board with a new design system.
Hi. My question is, when you're working with multiple teams, how do you manage your time with respect to getting design critiques from other designers, especially given that in an agile environment, there is literally like no time, like especially if you're working with multiple teams, you don't have much of a time to get to that.
So the Search UX team, what we have is we have twice weekly whole team crits set up. And it's an open door policy for any designer. So we sign up for time slots for the crit with our team. And it's a relatively large team compared to other groups. But once you sign up for that slot, then you also request other designers to come. And you pick people and you say, I want advice from Daniel and Kai and Diana today. And by pointing out those people, it makes them actually show up because you invited them to the crit. And at the same time, if you can send them out your work in advance, then that means that they're more invested in it as well, and they can actually give you some feedback rather than just seeing something and blurting out what they see at the crit. So that's one way that's really helpful. And then just like with an engineering team, it's all about face time. And so what I really try to do is have a 50-50 split or 60-40 split between spending time with the engineering team and design team. Because I find that I don't become a better designer by sitting with my engineering team. And so it's really important for me to get back with my design team as well.
Hey, Abby. Nice presentation. I'm curious, you mentioned style guides and delivering those. I'd like to hear you sort of describe how how your approach to delivering your design work to your developers has evolved over time. If you thought back to when you started compared to what you do now and how you've refined it, what kind of modifications have you made? What kind of lessons have you learned by doing that and improving along the way?
Sure. I used to wireframe, and then I started at Google, and I made a wireframe for Google Search, and it just looked like a really bad version of Google Search. And I realized that wireframing didn't really make sense in that context. So with the team, I sketch first, and we do it collaboratively. So we whiteboard together a product. I take photos of those. I send them to our team. And I also include them in our internal team site. And then the way that I keep a style guide internally for our team up to date is by creating a doc and including links to the larger Google style guides that we have. So that when those things update, then we have links that automatically go to them. When there are things that are just special to our team, like, hey, this column is 270 pixels wide and that's just how it is, then that's in our own internal style guide. What's nice about using a system like Google Docs for us is that we all have access to it, and you can see a revision history as well. So you can go back and say, oh yeah, I'm looking for that thing that used to be 333, but now it's not anymore, and find that in the style guide. And that's really helpful.
One more question back there.
Hi, thank you. So you elaborated a bit on the relationship between design and engineering. Could you talk more about the relationship between design and the product management group?
Sure. So the teams that I've worked on, how we typically work together is we actually have a sort of triumvirate for a product. And that's that the product manager, the design lead, and the engineering lead are responsible for the overall user experience and product success. And how it works generally is that the engineering lead has a whole team of engineers that are working with them, and they have to figure out how to convince those people to do things. And then there's one designer and there's one product manager, and you're sort of on your own together. And so it means I sit next to my product manager, and every time we're going to figure out a new thing about our design, we keep track of the decisions we make. So we have a thing called a decision log, and the product manager and I, or any engineer who has a question or wants to know something or wants an update on something, can put an entry in the decision log, which is literally an Excel spreadsheet with a line for, like, hey, I think we should show, books in 2 pages instead of a single page. You have a discussion, you make a decision, you write down the decision you made. And so being able to log those things and actually document them makes a lot of sense. I think the biggest transition that I've had to make in my career as a professional designer is figuring out how to document really, really quickly and what to document. And it's one of those things, it's like flossing your teeth. It makes a dentist appointment a lot better when you do it.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, Abby Jones.
Thank you.